Spike. I am editor-in-chief of the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Forum, and I'm very happy to have you all here. I hope you're enjoying our day so far. It's been very exciting and lively, and I'm sure it will only get more so this afternoon. First off, I would like to thank once again our co-sponsors, Duke Law and the Nicholas Institute, as well as the Nicholas School and the Public Policy School. Without them, we would not be here. I'd also like to thank my staff for putting in hours, making binders, helping with registration, and doing all the little things that make the day move smoothly. But most specifically, I would like to thank the three people who made this event possible. Down front here we have Miss Ingrid. Ingrid has done a phenomenal job, and she will please come here and receive her little token of appreciation. Ingrid will be receiving, please. I got Ingrid gift certificates to Shade Tree Coffee as she scheduled meetings there repeatedly over the past month, so I figured the money would be used wisely there. And I'll take her there later, so it doesn't matter. Also, I'd like to thank Mark Hill, who is our other symposium editor, who has done a phenomenal job. Mark will be dining at the Q Shack. That's right. Yes, sir. You're welcome. Thank you. And also, we had a new addition this year. We were extremely lucky to have Nancy Kelly, the Nicholas Institute's event coordinator, to help us out this year and to make everything run smoothly. And we would please give a hand for Nancy. Nancy will be dining at the brand new Cheesecake Factory at South Point. And just opened it. We just found out and had someone go get her a gift certificate right now. That's right. Thank you. So thank you very much to these people. Another round of applause. It's been a great day. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this panel. Steve Roady is an attorney with Earthjustice, and for all of us here, we also know he is a fabulous professor at Duke of Ocean Law and Policy. And if you haven't taken the class, make sure it's on your agenda for next year. Mr. Roady.
Thanks, Sarah. That's extra credit right there. I appreciate that. I want to thank you, Sarah, and Ingrid, and Mark, and everybody who made this event possible. I know the people that I've worked with here have been working on this pretty hard since about last March or April, as I recall. A lot of work goes into these events. And it's not always visible to people who come in and just show up and grab the name tags and suck down the coffee, you know. So it's well done, and I'm really glad to be here, honored to be here. And I also want to thank the hosts, the Duke Law School, the Nicholas School, and the Sanford Institute for hosting a very worthwhile effort. You know, I know we're in what my son calls the siesta hour now, which is the post-lunch hour. So we're going to try to make this panel a little lively for you. We have three very distinguished panelists here to talk about basically whether the concept of regional ocean governance actually has any prayer of working. We've talked a lot today about various theoretical issues and some more practical issues, but these panelists, I think, are here to bring us down to some of the practical realities of things. We have Professor Donna Christie from Florida State, Professor Andy Rosenberg from the University of New Hampshire, and Professor Josh Eagle from the University of South Carolina. They've all had tremendous range of experience. I'll introduce Professor Christie first, but before I do that, I just want to observe a couple of things. I thought our panelists this morning set this up pretty well. You know, the first three panelists talked about things like what kind of desperate shape we're in right now with the oceans. I know that Laura opened up by pointing out that the U.S. Commission, for example, as well as the Pew Oceans Commission, made the point that the current system we have for governance doesn't seem to be working exceptionally well. So the question becomes, well, if it's not working all that well, what do you do about it? The Pew Oceans Commission had the idea that maybe we'd have these regional councils, and they actually gave some thought to the notion that councils would have some power to take some regulatory action. The U.S. Commission kind of liked the idea of regional ocean councils, but as best I read the report, didn't give them a whole lot of muscle and teeth. In any event, that's potentially a problem, but the point that I think that Susan made was that it's also an opportunity, because if in fact we have a situation in our country where the current system isn't working very well, and someone has suggested something new to try out, that's a real opportunity to design the new system, following Professor Hannah's suggestions, in a way that, maybe loads up the incentives in the right way, minimizes the transaction costs, and gets it done properly. And I would just suggest, as we move forward, we'll make her the czar of organizing these new regional councils so she can apply those principles to the new councils. But that brings us to the problem we face, I think was pointed out by the second panel of the day, which was, if you listen to Craig and you listen to Amber and to David, the truth is we already have kind of little mini regional things going on. California's got their own regional, as it were, council working. Washington and Oregon are working on kind of a regional concept. Maine certainly is working, the 3 states and the 2 provinces. And so the question I have is, well, if that's all going on, where's the incentive for any of these people to actually do something new or different? If they're already doing something at these state levels, what's in it for them? Where's the carrot? Where's the stick? Where's the motivation? Even if we all recognize what's going on now isn't perfect. So, having said all that, our panelists are going to jump into the workability of this concept. And we're going to start with Professor Christie. Professor Christie actually has a background in chemistry from University of Georgia and also got her law degree at Georgia. Ended up doing some postdoc work at Woods Hole for a couple of years, and is now one of the recognized authorities in the topics we're covering today. She's a co-author, along with Professor Kalo from Carolina, who's actually here with us today, of the textbook that a lot of my students have been reading in ocean and coastal law. And she has most recently worked on Appendix 6, I think it was, to the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy Report, that's sort of a survey of U.S. ocean and coastal law. So let me turn it over to Professor Christie.
Okay, I'm up. All right. This will work, right? Nothing's happening. I need my PowerPoint here. Where is the person?
We're not doing PowerPoint this afternoon.
Yeah. Okay, that button. That one. Aha, okay, we are. Okay, well, I'm very happy to be here today, and as I listened to some of the talks this morning, I was afraid that there wasn't going to be anything left for me to say this afternoon, and then after Steve got through, then there definitely wasn't anything. I said, oh, he's giving my talk. Okay, no. What I wanted to do is, now that we're focusing on this idea of regional ocean governance, that maybe we could look out there and see where we have some agreement and where we're diverging. As everybody has pointed out in their first slides, we do have these 2 reports, and they do agree that there has to be some kind of major changes in ocean management to stop the degradation of the ocean resources, and that we have to do this through an ecosystem management approach. It's kind of funny, though. I mean, when the Pew Commission report came out, a lot of the conservatives around the Capitol in Tallahassee, all this gloom and doom that's being reported, and it's all how terrible it is. And then when the USCOP report came out, we had a big Oceans Day presentation at the Capitol, and it was kind of, see, we told you it wasn't all that terrible. And I said, have you read it? And they said, well, no. And I said, well, the findings are the same. They came to the same conclusions. They said, yeah, but they're not going to make us do anything about it. So it was a very, very different feel about what was going on about the 2 reports, and whether both of them were saying that we are in some kind of state of emergency, that something needs to be done about, or not. And it seems like collaborative efforts, if that's what we're trying to get to, seem to work best when groups feel like their backs against the wall. And Pew maybe made people feel, or at least was trying to give the impression that our backs were against the wall. And USCOP maybe gives us the impression, well, we got a long time to work on this. As long as we start in the right direction, it'll be okay. What I wanted to do today is to look at the models that we currently have before us, including the ones from the Pew Commission and the USCOP report, as well as the U.S. Ocean Plan, House Bill 2939 that's out there now, Oceans 21, and Senate Bill 1224, the National Ocean Protection Act. Okay. But first, you obviously have to talk about how these things are really quite different. We have everybody seeming to take the position that it's virtually a truism that we have to have ecosystem management or ecosystem-based management. Pretty much in the same way as it's a truism that we have to have sustainable development at that. But there doesn't seem to be widespread agreement about what kind of response is necessary as far as setting up some kind of governance structure to be able to implement eco-regional governance of the oceans. Now, we have seen that there's very little relationship between these ecoregions and any kind of geopolitical boundaries and jurisdictional boundaries. We have the federal government up on top, and then we have the state government. We don't have anything in between. We don't have any kind of regional governance structure. We're just not set up with our concepts of federalism and separation of powers to provide the institutional bases for this. So we don't have a way to respond institutionally at the ecosystem level. And the competences we have at the federal level and especially at the state level are very jealously guarded. This is, I think, what Susan was talking about this morning is power ambiguity. If you try to create another level of governance that isn't there in our federal system, what is that going to mean as far as the power that the states still have? The states are very much against another level of government over them, telling them what to do. And I think that's one of the reasons we had the response that I saw in Tallahassee to USCOP, that they're not going to put another level of governance over to us to tell us what to do. Eco-regional governance also suggests reallocation of power and authority that raises democratic concerns. Again, I'm just reiterating what Susan said this morning. When we're creating this different level of government that doesn't have any real democratic authenticity, any democratic jurisdiction, we raise all kinds of problems like transparency. In many of the proposals we're seeing, there's a very direct involvement by stakeholders. And there's a big question and problem about whether those stakeholders may be able to capture the process. And so that's an issue that has to be addressed. Accountability. Again, Susan had that on her list this morning. We're lawyers, we like rules, we like things to be rule-driven. We want to know who's in charge. We want to know, who's whether anything's being accomplished, and what's the product, and what's the goals. I used to have transactions costs on this list too, and it would look like I completely copied her list if I had done that. So, but I took that off. But that obviously is not a small problem either. So all of these things are considerations when you look at any kind of analysis of proposals for ocean governance at the regional level. The Pew Ocean Commission's report takes the strongest position. Their regional ecosystem councils were proposed to have an executive decision-making core made up of federal, state, and tribal authorities. They would have a robust and influential advisory process. And at the heart of their function would be regional ocean governance plans. These regional ocean governance plans would require approval at the federal level. So you had some kind of standards, guidelines, national ocean policies that he was going to have to conform to. They would have to be consistent with those national ocean policy standards that would be developed sometime in the future, but there were guidelines in the Pew Commission report. And here we have, again, this idea of clear and measurable management and restoration goals and performance standards, incorporating even ocean zoning into the process. So getting fairly technical here as to where you're going and as far as accountability. And even more scary to some people, they saw these plans as having teeth, that they would be enforceable, binding and enforceable against all parties, against the states, against the federal government. That would be incorporated into kind of a consistency mechanism in the Coastal Zone Management Act. It talked in terms of federal preemption of state actions that were inconsistent with regional ocean governance plans, and it also included citizen suit provisions. Okay. Now, USCOP took a bit of a different direction, much less structured and evolving system of regional ocean councils. Voluntary, would be established by the states, and then beyond that, it was kind of, okay, states, you do it. You decide what your functions are going to be. You decide who's going to be involved. You know your regions, you know what needs to be done. It's up to you. Go ahead. They did provide a little bit of guidelines that these councils should be set up over areas of large marine ecosystems and incorporate landward areas back into coastal watersheds, that they should be a wide range of ocean and coastal issues that were, and be a broadly representative process. Okay. Functions of these ocean councils that were recommended included regional plans and priorities, creating collaborative processes, and providing means to communicate regional needs and concerns to the federal level. Okay. Importantly, because it was pointed out this morning how slow the whole process is when you're starting with regional organizations, they said, look at what's out there already, see what we can build on. That the existing regional initiatives provide a good starting point. We might be able to take things that are out there and already functioning and expand them to deal with other initiatives. And also the experience and their expertise in these programs that people have had with them can be transferable, and that should be looked at too. Okay. As far as coordination with the federal level, all of these things, all these reports, all of the legislation does create new bodies at the executive office of the president level to try to make more visibility for ocean matters. Most of the proposals have an advisory committee as well as a body like this U.S. Commission or like this National Ocean Commission or the Committee on Ocean Policy that's actually up there now. But this proposal, this new National Ocean Council under the USCOP proposal, would be charged with helping develop this voluntary process. Their advisory council would be the one that would bring regional concerns to the table. And very importantly, federal agencies would be reorganized along eco-regional lines. When you think about it, how many million miles here? 3.4 million square miles of EEZ. That's a lot of area. So if you're just looking spatially at the oceans we're talking about and who has jurisdiction over managing that, certainly the federal agencies have jurisdiction over a huge part spatially, even if it doesn't lead to the ability to address all the problems, because a lot of the problems are coming from the landward side of the territorial sea. But having federal agencies realigned, reorganized along eco-regional lines kind of creates the basis there for states and regional organizations to be able to work with those agencies in a better way. Okay. Now, the U.S. Ocean Action Plan had to respond. The president had to respond to the USCOP report, and he did with this U.S. Ocean Action Plan and an executive order implementing it. And as far as the regional developments and regional councils, everyone has mentioned this morning that nothing much happened, that this was, that was more of a hands-off approach by the president as far as these regional ocean councils. In the executive order, implementing the cabinet-level committee on ocean policy, they were directed to provide and obtain information to facilitate these voluntary regional approaches, but that's pretty much it. The federal government did say that as far as the action plan, that regional collaborations should be supported, and talked about several of ones that they thought were supported by federal ocean policy. All right, now we get into a couple of the major bills that have been introduced that address regional ocean governance, because although a lot of bills have been introduced, not many of them speak to regional ocean governance. The first one, National Ocean Policy Act, talks about regional approaches to government, but mostly just in implementing the idea from the USCOP report of reorganizing federal agencies along those lines. And then the newly constituted NOAA would then be responsible really for facilitating eco-regional management, enhanced state and local capabilities. In no less than about 9 sections in that act does it say NOAA needs to get out there and work with the states, get regional cooperation going quickly. But it puts everything on NOAA as far as getting out there and doing something about facilitating any kind of regional ocean management. Really takes it pretty much out of the department. There is an enforcement mechanism that is part of this National Ocean Policy Protection Act, but it only applies to federal agencies, you see. It's a certification process that their actions comply with laws that relate to ocean and coastal waters and resources, and then to finding that they would not significantly degrade the health of marine resources or likely to impede the restoration of marine resources. NOAA would make recommendations if they didn't concur, and the agency would be required to incorporate the recommendations into their action. So it's a pretty stiff kind of certification process, applying only at the federal level, though, and not requiring the regional councils, the states, to have any kind of consistency with any kind of national ocean policy or anything that was developed. House Bill 2939, very cleverly, if you look at the letters, Oceans 21, that's referred to. And in this case, they talk about creating regional ocean partnerships rather than regional ocean councils. But rather than waiting for the states to voluntarily put together some kind of response at the regional level, it requires the appointment of a creation of these 8 regional partnerships and the appointment of people from these areas, and I'm not going to spend time covering all of that, as you can read it there. The regional partnerships do bring in stakeholders and advisory groups. They would be able to set up as many advisory groups and working groups as they needed, but they would be required to create a citizens advisory committee as part of their process. National Research Council is also directed to do a study to evaluate ecosystem management approaches that are being done now, and to make a report to the Committee on Ocean Policy, to NOAA Administrator, to regional councils on better ways and mechanisms to deal with regional governance approaches. I'm not sure whether that's putting the horse before the cart or not. These partnerships their functions were set out here, improving communication, coordination, but the big piece of this element is number 3, creating a strategic plan, a regional strategic plan for the oceans. Development and monitoring of regional ocean strategic plans. Now, these would have to be approved by the NOAA administrator, and based on adequately addressing the elements that's set out in the act for the plan, and would have to be consistent with the guiding principles of a regional act. And this was set out as to protect, maintain, and restore the health of marine ecosystems and to provide for the ecologically sustainable use and management of the oceans. So it does require some product, some accountability, some timetable for starting to move on these issues that may or may not be emergencies that we need to deal with. Only requires implementation to the maximum extent practicable by members of the regional ocean partnerships. Now, it's, those of you that know that term from the Coastal Zone Management Act, the states would want maximum extent practicable to mean for the federal authorities that they would have to do it unless their law required them to do otherwise. For the states would like for that to mean we'll do what we feel like. Okay. Coordination at the federal level. The Committee on Ocean Policy would be created under this legislation just carries on the Committee on Ocean Policy. It's been set up in the Ocean Action Plan, the President's Plan. Reconstitutes it slightly, but still at a presidential level. They have the responsibility for facilitating these regional partnerships, but they also have to create what's referred to in this act as a balanced ecosystem-based management regime for activities in federal waters. Okay. And designate the lead agency for ocean activities and uses. And then, when we get down to the end, a process or mechanism to ensure that these agencies coordinate with states and regional ocean partnerships. You know, whether that's edging towards saying they're going to have to be consistent with these regional ocean plans, doesn't quite go that far, but it suggests that. Whoops, I turned it off again. Okay, here we go. All right, what I got here again. They do have an enforcement mechanism there. Again, it's only at the federal level. Okay. And looking back over these different models, what we see with the Pew Commission is that it creates a strong plan, but it's simply not going to go. The states just are not going to accept another level of governance over them. And it also envisions the states providing a substantial amount of funding that the states aren't interested in either. USCOP is interesting from the aspect that it doesn't require really any legislation to start working. There's very little problem in transactions cost for it to start moving forward. It doesn't contain any national goals or standards for councils. It does avoid issues of dealing with the states. They retain their autonomy. But it is very long-term, very incremental, no formal mechanisms to cut across jurisdictional boundaries. The Oceans Action Plan and NOPA really take very only incremental measured first steps. The Ocean 21 bill tries to find something in between, retains the state autonomy. However, it isn't just going to say, okay, we're just going to sit here on our hands and wait for the states to get around to forming some kind of regional approach. Does have some accountability, and the problem is that going back again to Susan's talk, the incentives. You know, what are the incentives here? It's good. Just having funding, technical assistance from the federal government may not be enough. It's been shown before, for example, in the Coastal Zone Management Act, that maybe a carrot approach that goes beyond that, giving some tool like federal consistency requirement, might be the way to get states to come in and stay in, because it gives them a powerful tool to work with in the future. Okay. I went a little over my time, but. They didn't turn off my microphone.
Thank you, Professor Christie. We're holding questions until we rocket through the panel presenters. It's my great pleasure now to introduce the gentleman whom I first met arguing over stellar sea lions in the famous litigation in the North Pacific, Dr. Andy Rosenberg. Dr. Rosenberg brings, I think, a unique blend of academic and practical training to this discussion. Academically, he was trained in fisheries biology and that sort of thing, but then he got thrown into the fire as the regional administrator for the Northeast region for the Marine Fisheries Service just about the time when the cod stocks had about collapsed, and he was forced to deal with that fairly challenging situation in the Northeast for a while. And he did so well that he was promoted to become the second in command, the deputy administrator at NEP's national headquarters in Washington, and served a couple of years there, and survived that as well, and rotated back out into academia, and is now at the University of New Hampshire, and I'm sure has some interesting observations for us. Dr. Rosenberg?
Thanks, Steve. I think he likes to say that about stellar sea lions because he won. But he's just too modest to actually add that part. Well, this will be a little bit odd because people have been talking about the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy all day, and I think I'm the only one in the room who was actually on the commission, although Laura wrote a good part of the report, and Susan and Michael were on the advisory panels. So I'm not going to talk about the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy report. It's a little bit like the discussion that I've often had with congressional staffers where people will say, well, but I know what we meant. And I will say, well, I don't really care what you meant. I only care about what you wrote. I do actually think that there's some, we could argue over what the commission reports say for quite a while. But suffice it to say that I actually don't think the U.S. Commission recommendation is in any way weaker with regard to implementation of ecosystem-based management or regional ocean governance than the Pew Commission report, even though it calls for regional development of voluntary pilot programs to start off regional ocean councils. And the reason I don't think it's weaker is it also calls for a national ocean policy with a set of principles. And it seems to me that if you actually do the restructuring and re-governance tasks that the Commission report calls for, then you can require compliance with those sets of ecosystem-based management principles and governance principles in all of the enabling legislation, as opposed to putting a separate oversight body which simply battles back and forth with the existing governance structure. We could talk about that for quite a long time, but it's simply a matter of approach, and I actually think that in both cases you can have a strong and enforceable and accountable regional ocean governance system under either report. I have no idea what I have on the slides. There we go. So the Commission does call for regional ocean and coastal governance, regional goals consistent with national goals. It does not call for national standards, and that was a negotiated wording, I think, in the Commission discussions. It does call for a precautionary approach to management, calls for regional information management systems, which are usually regarded by policy people as a throwaway. And my only comment would be, if you don't have better information than you currently have to manage on and accessibility of that information, then what is it that you're going to be basing your policy on? You have some fishery information systems that are pretty weak, and they're vastly better than almost anything else for any other sector out there. And so if you don't address the management information problem, then I think that it's hard to imagine you'll end up with a scientific basis for regional governance. Most importantly, from my perspective, the report calls, and the Pew Commission report, both call for a coordinated ecosystem-based approach, which we've been talking about somewhat all day, except for that nobody's said what that means. So I would refer you to a science consensus statement developed by COMPASS, which is Communication Partnership for Science in the Sea. It's been signed on to by over 200 scientists, which describes what ecosystem-based management means and gives some suggestions for how to go about it. And there's been some argument. Some scientists didn't sign on because they didn't like the statement, because they wanted to do the academic thing of argue for the next 20 or 30 years over what is the meaning of ecosystem health. There are other people who want to argue forever over how you draw the boundaries for an ecosystem. And as Larry pointed out very cogently, who cares? Because we know any boundaries we draw are going to be leaky because there is no perfect ecosystem boundary isolated off unless you want to use the entire Earth as the ecosystem. And even then, we could argue that there's some leakiness. So a consensus statement actually is an effort to identify key elements and be clear about them. So every time someone says, well, we have no idea what this means, nobody knows what it means, it's just a buzzword, well, actually, that's not true. It's fairly clear what it means. To me, it focuses on a couple of only a few major points. That is, you consider the entire ecosystem, including the humans, within whatever boundary you draw for a particular purpose. And in the case of regional governance, using large marine ecosystem concept as expanded as needed to cover areas that are not covered is a fairly straightforward way to go about this. Perhaps most importantly, it focuses on cumulative impacts and interaction of management actions, even though it doesn't say that other part there. The two fundamentals are cumulative impacts of human activities and the interactions between management actions in different sectors. And then finally, the whole idea is based on the idea that you're trying to maintain an ecosystem in a healthy and productive, resilient condition. In other words, you're trying to maintain a set of ecosystem services. And there are lots of services that are provided by marine ecosystems, and most of them are virtually ignored or relocated to a secondary or tertiary priority in the current management structure and in the legislation as far as I'm concerned. We focus on the commodities. Those are the primary services that the current structure focuses on, but there's lots of other things that occur in ecosystems, and the best example I can think of is with Hurricane Katrina, the wetlands in the Gulf clearly were providing an important service that we just decided to ignore for a while. That is, they take the energy out of storms as they come ashore. And when you remove them, they don't take the energy out of storms when they come ashore, and you get a predictable result. So there is a whole set of services that are key, services provided by ecosystems that are key to human well-being. And the focus is still on human well-being. So this is not, well, I like pretty environments better than ugly environments. The focus is still on human well-being. And in ecosystem-based management, you move from, in particular, single sector approaches to multi-sector approaches, small scales to multiple scales, not just large scale, short-term to long-term, and so on. Well, we know there are lots of different things going on in the marine environment, lots of different sectors, and when I refer to sectors, I mean to sectors of human activity. And so I've spent a part of my working life working on the fisheries sector, but there's lots of other things going on. And it's fairly easy to just become, to have blinders on within your sector and think that that's the only part that matters and we only need to deal with a particular set of sectoral activities. So one idea that's current now is that you do ecosystem-based fishery management, and then perhaps you do ecosystem-based coastal management, and we could do ecosystem-based water quality management. And would that be sufficient? And from my perspective, no, it wouldn't be sufficient. It is important to manage an ecosystem as a whole, and a lot of the failures that we've had in fisheries and other places are because we've managed individual parts of the ecosystem, and we've mismanaged those parts. So in fisheries, in coastal development, in water quality, in many cases, we've had substantial mismanagement. Well, that doesn't mean you don't need to manage the parts. It doesn't mean you don't need to do fisheries management. You need to do something else entirely. It means just doing the fishery management, managing for the commodity, is insufficient. So it's not either or. It's not that you no longer do the sectoral management. It's that you need to do more than the sectoral management. If you look at ecosystem-based fisheries management, then, yeah, you can manage the impacts of fisheries on habitat and non-target species and ecosystem structure and function. But other sectors are going to affect fisheries productivity as well. So again, if you do it in isolation, you're likely to end up with a system that's insufficient to actually protect ecosystem goods and services. In addition to that, the tendency will always be to remain within the sector. So the fisheries councils now are very actively developing fishery ecosystem management plans, ecosystem-based management plans. Why are they doing that? It's because they would much rather deal with the community they know and tell everybody else to leave them alone. Keep the decision-making within the affected community. Did I already get that 5-minute warning? Good. So it's much more comfortable to remain within the sector because it's obviously complicated to figure out, well, how does this relate to coastal development or wetlands loss or water quality? But if you don't do that, you will end up, again, doing a necessary task, managing the sectoral impacts on ecosystems, but not a sufficient task because you're not managing the cumulative impacts and the interactions. Come on. So let's look at an example, and it's the only example I ever use because there aren't any others that matter. This is the Gulf of Maine, and my pen doesn't seem, there it is. Sort of works. Which is the center of the universe, as I'm sure you know. This one works. These are closed areas in the Gulf of Maine. All of these little labels are closed areas. Just to point out a few of them, the big ones here, Great South Channel, is a critical habitat area for endangered right whales. These sort of darker tan colors are fishery closed areas. There are a couple more now, but these were closed. This was produced in 2001 by the Oceans Conservancy. So here again is a big right whale area. These are fishery closed areas for scallops and groundfish and so on. But then you've got all these small closed areas all along the coast. They're all designed for individual purposes. I mean, I closed these areas. I used to be 6'3" before I closed those areas. You know, it's not an easy thing to do, but they were designed for fisheries. I also was responsible for closing these areas, and we did that as an entirely separate exercise, even within the same agency. And of course, all these little dots, which are protected in some way, were done as separate exercises again, and they were usually done for a single purpose. Well, if you took this to extreme and tried to map the regulations for this area, you know, even though I was signing off on them at the time, I would be challenged to figure out what you could do and where you could do it, let alone, you know, standing on the deck of a fishing boat. So the point here is that we have a disjunct system because we've dealt with things in a very piecemeal fashion. What I would suggest from this slightly bizarre goggle-eyed chart is that you could do that in a more sensible fashion by trying to utilize a zoning approach. And now I'm suggesting that we know the centers of distribution and the oceanography for the Gulf of Maine. We also know that some areas are critical habitat for lots of different things, for right whales, but that's because right whales like to go there and eat things, and other things like to eat as well. And so these areas like the Northeast Peak and the Great South Channel and Jeffrey's Ledge area are critically important. So now I've just drawn this speculatively such that you have a expanding picture of protection. So in the very center, perhaps you have fully protected areas. As you move out through these circles, you have somewhat different set of protections or zones where certain activities are allowed. And similarly, as you move out from the coast, you just find a set of activities that will be allowed in an expanding way as you move further and further offshore. Obviously, very close to shore, some activities are more important than others. Some protections are more important than others. So the question then is, well, how do you define a set of protections that might fall within those zones? And I would say that you develop a set of goals for each zone, and you develop those goals on the basis of conservation of ecosystem services. So you may have eutrophication reduction targets within 3 miles and wetlands and submerged vegetation targets as goals within 3 miles, but they may be quite different sorts of targets in the offshore zones, where they're conservation targets for specific living marine resources or diversity and structure kinds of things. And then you develop a strategy in order to achieve those specific goals, and obviously a set of tactics that are designed to implement that strategy. So a simple structure, management structure of a set of goals, some strategies, and then some tactics. Well, who develops the tactics? You still probably have the sectors develop the tactics, because you're not going to have a regional ocean council arguing over the hook size in the cod fishery. Nobody's going to know what the hell they're talking about. Even the people who know what they're talking about on that subject don't know what they're talking about. So, you know, it's not appropriate to do that sort of discussion at a broad ecosystem level, but it is important to have the strategy developed at an ecosystem level. And it's important to have the goals developed at a national level. So you need to have some specific goals that relate to ecosystem services at that national level, a strategy to achieve those goals at a regional level, which may be very, very different from region to region, and then a set of tactics for how are we actually going to get to that strategy. Now those tactics need to be developed within the sectors. The important part is they need to be to meet those ecosystem level goals, not just the sectoral goals. What you're trying to gain out of this is fit the pieces together. So you could, if you modified the existing legislation on fisheries, require the fishery management plans to be in compliance with some ecosystem-based management plan for the region without creating a new regulatory structure. You could require the federal agency, that's the basis on which they approve it. You need to improve the accountability for fisheries now, you would have to have better accountability for that sort of structure. But the goal is to fit together those pieces so that you do look at cumulative impacts. You base the management goals on sustaining specific ecosystem functions and then allow the actors to remain within the management plan. And what you're trying to gain out of that is coherence. In other words, something that isn't working in opposition to one another. All those overlapping closed areas I showed you work in opposition to one another because people will try to find ways to make the rules work against each other such that they can provide as much flexibility as they need, as opposed to making the rules support each other in some more coherent way. Presumably you could end up with less confusion, or you should end up with less confusion. You would have the ability to assess and address cumulative impacts, and that is more effective management as opposed to the system that currently is in place. And I think that's it, and I'm within time almost. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenberg. It's always bracing to hear from you. You know, the mind virtually swims with questions, but I'm going to try to be good and not ask my questions before the crowd asks their questions. So let's go to our next. You're not answering. I mean, I have to ask, and how do you get buy-in to each of the zones? But we'll go on to Professor Eagle. Yeah, well, who's going to answer the question? Josh Eagle is a rising star in the ocean and conservation legal community. He actually, I think, studied forestry or something in undergraduate school, or maybe got a master's degree in forestry, but he went off and was a lawyer with the Justice Department for 4 or 5 years, and then worked at National Audubon as a lawyer for a couple of years, and ended up running a really interesting project at Stanford for a while, the Fisheries Institute out there, where they did some serious drilling down at the behavior of some of the regional fishery management councils. A couple of very interesting studies, including I'm sure the best-selling little work called Answering Lord Perry's Question about how regulatory overfishing actually takes place, and did a couple of other things. And now he's a professor of law at the University of South Carolina. So, Josh.
Thanks, Steve. All right, well, I can't even begin to tell you how excited I am to be here. I have a great life, and I don't say that because I'm a speaker. That's probably the worst part of it. But the best part is that you get to come to rooms like this that are full of people who are excited and passionate about the same kinds of things that you are. So I appreciate you're all coming. And to the students out there, I would just tell you a couple things. First, one thing that's been my experience, I'm relatively new in this field, even though I look older than some of these people, like Roady and Andy maybe. I didn't mention Mike. There's some great mentors out there for you, and they all served as mentors to me, whether they want to admit it or not, in public, in different ways. So I'd just like to thank Mike and Larry and Andy and Steve for that role they play for me, and I think they will do that for you, and I hope you do that for your students later in your careers. I'll also point out sometimes there's a cause for pessimism in this field, or people start talking negatively about the future. And I'll just give you a piece of advice that was given to me by one of my other mentors, who was a man named Carl Safina, who was the person who first introduced me to the twisted world of fisheries. And Carl has an incredible ability to merge optimism and pessimism in the same sentence, who once told me, we were sitting around throwing out some ideas for improving U.S. fishery management, and he said, Josh, go ahead and be brave and be experimental in anything you suggest. It's a great world for you. He said, nothing you can come up with will be worse than what we've been doing for the last 30 years. So I think I've taken that to heart, and I hope you look at things that way yourself. So what I want to do is talk a little bit more about institutional issues and policy issues. I think it ties nicely into what Andy was talking about. Before I start with the slides, which I'm going to have to blister through here in a breakneck pace, but before I start out with those, I'd like to just mention that one of the interesting things, I love words. And I used to be I was actually an English major undergrad before I went into forestry and law. And I like studying words. So I've done things like sit around for 4 days and read the legislative history of the Magnuson Act in 1976 and count the number of times that the word overfishing appears in that 1,000-page document without the word foreign in front of it. And the answer is maybe twice out of about 400 occurrences. So, but another interesting thing is if you look through all the law review and policy articles about ocean policy and ocean governance, you often see the phrase still tragedy of the commons in those articles. And I'm fascinated by that because in Garrett Hardin's original article, what he said was really we need an ownership of this resource in order to obviate the commons problem. And that ownership can come in one of two ways: privatization, single private owner, or government regulation, a single public owner. And so a lot of what motivates my work has been looking at this idea of why has our government, our agencies, who are our ownership agents, not been able to achieve those results that Hardin predicted would be achieved through ownership of the resource. Okay, the government agency has not, for whatever reason, been able to express or act in the way that an owner would, protecting that resource for the long term. Okay, so the ocean commissions, and you've heard all this, so I will be able to buzz through some of this, basically agreed that there were two problems in our current set of ocean laws and institutions, okay, that have contributed, and this is important, to the poor conservation results. One of them was that within single ecosystems, jurisdiction over interacting uses is divided among governments, state, federal, and local governments. The other one is that within those ecosystems, jurisdiction is divided among agencies. Okay, these are two different kinds of jurisdictional split. And so an example, I'll give you, we saw a picture of this earlier today, and my map might be a little off, but California current ecosystem, let's see if we can, there we go. Close-up view, that's the part that's in, as Lefty Drizel used to say, the United States. And here's the coastal ecosystem as it goes inland, okay? So this is really our ecosystem that we're talking about here. And so the first problem is that the political jurisdiction is splintered, okay? So we've got the United States with federal government with jurisdiction over the exclusive economic zone. By the way, another interesting footnote on my love of words, it's amazing how many people talk about our exclusive economic zone as if we actually have one, but we really don't, since we've never really become a party to the law of the sea. We actually just, it's a fiction that we have one unless you believe in instantaneous customary international law, which I don't believe in. Okay, but anyway, we've got this fictional exclusive economic zone that we claim jurisdiction over under international law. And we've got other things like state waters out to 3 miles under the Submerged Lands Act. We've got state jurisdiction, obviously, over issues out in these inland areas. And then, of course, we've got thousands of towns and counties that have jurisdiction over land use, which have huge effects on things like runoff, et cetera. Okay, so we've got a lot of fractured political jurisdiction. Okay, we've also got this fractured use jurisdiction, which is the agency problem. So in the exclusive economic zone, right, we've got the fisheries that are managed by NOAA Fisheries, formerly known as the Fisheries Service, I think, and the Pacific Council. I'm never quite clear on that. Maybe Andy can explain that to me later. The Pacific Council, we've got the Minerals Management Service, which does our offshore oil and gas and our offshore mining. And then we've got the EPA doing water quality within some part of that. Okay, so we've got this, and so these are the problems I think that the commissions are alluding to, that this results in poor conservation. Okay, so their solution, and I think this was Donna and Andy kind of expressed this, is more comprehensive, coherent, holistic approaches. And so what I'm going to argue for today is a more incoherent, no, I'm just kidding, a less comprehensive, less holistic approach, okay? And so the examples are the kinds of things that you can see this in the language of the two reports. They go from things like regional fishery management councils to regional ocean councils, right? We're not just focused on one resource or one use or one sector. We're going to have these broader agencies, okay, that do more things, more resources, more uses. Now, they don't go to the extreme, right? This would be our extreme where we had, you know, a council that had full jurisdiction over all these uses throughout this entire range, right? Even potato farming out in Idaho and, you know, timber harvest, right? But that's the idea that we seem to be moving towards, and I have a lot of trepidation when I think about that, and I'll tell you why. I want to give you some lessons from the application of a comprehensive, holistic approach to managing the public lands, okay? And then I'm going to give you my case for a less comprehensive and diverse approach to managing the oceans. And I call this this part the perils of multiple use management. All right, I want to look at the Federal Land Policy and Management Act and the Bureau of Land Management. That's the law and the agency that manages about 2/3 of our public lands. And these laws and these agencies sound a lot like what are being proposed by the ocean commissions, right? We just changed the word, the Federal Ocean Policy and Management Act, these big broad sounding terms, the Bureau of Ocean Management. It sounds a lot like what's in these reports. So the FLPMA, that's what I'm going to call it, that's the Federal Lands Act, requires the BLM to manage the full range of resources, flora, fauna, oil and gas, minerals, timber, while balancing, and that's the critical word, competing uses, including recreation, timber harvest, grazing, conservation, oil and gas, everything, right? It's a big, comprehensive, beautiful ecosystem-based agency. It also, interestingly, requires BLM to give priority to the creation and management of what are called areas of critical environmental concern. These are sort of like the equivalent of marine protected areas. So this actually sounds like what we might get out in a dream world from out of our most recent ocean discussions. Okay, the relevant outcomes is what I want to talk about of this FLPMA BLM approach to managing public lands, or how well does BLM mediate conflicts between these conflicting uses? And it's interesting because that's really what agencies are doing, right? Agencies are mediating between conflicting uses under these multiple use statutes. They're acting as, someone was talking about Mississippi courts of equity basically deciding what do we give priority to? Do we sort of lean towards sort of a lower risk of overfishing, or do we lean towards a higher risk of overfishing? Do we favor conservation over other things? Okay, so we're putting them in the role of arbiter. Okay, so this is what we get under BLM, notorious for allowing overgrazing to occur in some of the most beautiful spots in America. And I'm not going to go into the statistics, but we had no improvement since 1976 on most of these lands since we put the FLPMA into place. Here's an interesting one. These are BLM lands in the dark that were offered for oil and gas drilling between 1982 and the present. That's 229 million acres out of the 275 million acres that are there. Okay, so we can see that when it comes to mediating between competing uses, right, the oil and gas industry has been incredibly successful in obtaining the results that it wanted. Okay, and that doesn't even show the overgrazing. With respect to the areas of critical environmental concern, it's really interesting. They've done a fair number of these things, about 800 and some, over BLM lands, but none of them have any kind of stringent rules. They look a lot like our marine sanctuaries where they're designated, but they have very few rules restricting resource extraction in there. Okay. Now, one other problem with these kind of multiple use broad laws like the FLPMA is that, and you can ask Steve Roady this, it makes it almost impossible for citizens to sue these agencies to make them change the decision that they made through the agency process, because a court has no handle on that, right? The agency is charged with balancing. They balance, so they complied with the law. Okay, this is a big problem also, I would argue, with the current Magnuson Act. So my bottom line is that in the absence of guidance from the Congress, from legislative bodies, that government agencies struggle, and I don't mean they're evil, they struggle to balance consumptive and non-consumptive uses. They have a really hard time. Andy mentioned he got his head beaten down for trying to do these kinds of things. It's a really tough thing to do for agencies. And it's not surprising, right? Why do we think that agencies are good at balancing out competing uses? What makes them qualified to do that? I'm not sure. Oh, that's a live fish and a fish on your plate. That's what they're supposed to be balancing there. Okay. So here's why I think this happens. And the political science literature supports this. Agencies tend to make decisions that favor stronger, more well-organized interest groups. Everyone knows that, I hope. Conservation, not recreation, which is what supported the parks and a lot of the stuff that's happened, good stuff that's happened out west, is often the least powerful and well-organized of different competing user groups. And as a result, those interests don't often prevail in the multiple use arena. We can't think of many examples where this has happened either, I would argue, under the Magnuson Act. Sometimes it happens when we have brave people who will do things, but it's the exception rather than the rule. So what's the alternative to these bigger, broader, more comprehensive agencies? I would argue that we're better off with a diverse set of dominant and maybe mixed with a few multiple use agencies. Okay, under this model, the agency diversity model, agencies are explicitly charged by Congress or state legislatures to prioritize the needs of one constituency over all the other ones. Don't balance them. They're not asked to serve as these sort of social moderators of, okay, you get this, but you don't get that. Okay, I think that's a role for the legislature. So under this model, the mandates are narrow. It's easy to sue them if they don't do what they're supposed to do. We like that, right, Steve? Okay. And underlying this is the idea that these dominant use mandates, one way to look at them, like say the National Park Service Organic Act, those are a way of empowering groups that lose every time in the multiple use battle, in the arena that takes place in the BLM and in the Magnuson Act. Okay, they level the playing field. They're Congress giving a presumption to a weak group. Okay? So a lot of my thinking on this issue comes from things like voting rights, right? We used to have at-large voting districts. The problem with at-large voting districts is that minority groups never get a winner. You don't get a winner when you always get outvoted. So we went to districts where we set them up so that certain groups that are less powerful will get represented in the final decisions. And we don't see that, I don't think, under FLTMA or the Magnuson Act. Okay? Similarly, you can look at zoning laws. These are municipal zoning laws. Well, what do zoning laws do? Zoning laws protect you, the residential homeowner, okay, from having to compete economically for the quality of your neighborhood with people who have more money and want to put a gas station in your neighborhood, right? It creates a presumption against that use. If Exxon or the service station wants to come in there and build a gas station, they've got to negotiate with you even though they're more powerful. What an idea. Okay, so what would this system look like in the oceans? All right, so here's what it looks like in the public lands. This is what's called the GYE, Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. National park in the middle, of course, kind of a square-looking thing. I don't think that was an ecosystem. Surrounded by, I think, 7 national forests and 2 wildlife refuges. There's actually another park right down here, Teton. Okay, so we've got 3 different agencies: Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service on the refuges, okay, in this area, all trying to manage an ecosystem. Okay, and we might say, that stinks. We want one big agency managing everything. That's more consistent with principles of ecosystem management and holism. But you know what? I'm going to argue that this actually improves conservation because these are agencies that have specific functions. Okay, they give priority to certain uses over others. And this works both in Yellowstone, on the individual tract, okay, right there, and in the entire system. So how does it work for the entire system? We know it works in Yellowstone, right? If we make it a conservation area, we're going to have better conservation. But the important thing is, does it make the whole area better? Okay, so here's how I think this happens. I'm going to give you 4 examples of how a set of dominant use agencies, okay, mixed together, representing different interests, creates beneficial system-wide effects. Trading, generation of better information, I talked about the policy discourse earlier, portfolio effects, and experimentation. Okay, here's some interesting information. If you look at water quality, that's what that is on that map, those dark brown areas are the best water quality in the system. And what's really interesting here is that you end up with, obviously in Yellowstone, the park itself, we have the highest sort of concentration of good water quality, but the next highest are areas in the Forest Service lands that are close to the park. Okay, because these agencies don't just exist in a vacuum, they actually get together and trade things off, negotiate, okay, in ways that they wouldn't otherwise do if this were just one big agency. There's a great example of this with the grizzlies. The grizzlies were introduced or have been protected and have thrived in Yellowstone, and the Forest Service in that area has been extremely accommodating and protecting them on forest lands. But when you go to the Forest Service, say in Idaho, and try to say, we want grizzly bears in Bitterroot, they will completely deny you, okay? So they will accommodate, because of the presence of this other kind of agency, these other interest groups that's forced in there, they will accommodate other interests. And you see the same thing with roadless areas. They tend to protect roadless areas near the dominant use area, near the park, because of negotiations that take place between these essentially interest groups. Information generation. I think giving power to weaker groups through zoning or dominant use agencies creates information, because the stronger group is the one that's better at generating information. Let me give you an example. How many of you have ever thought about this or heard about this in the last 6 months? The incredible amount of land that's been offered for drilling. I mean, look at that. That is a big chunk of land in the West. No one has heard about it. No one cares about it because the industry has no incentive to generate any information or dialogue or high-level policy discussion about this at all. And environmental groups publish these reports, but no one hears about it. On the other hand, if you look at Anwar, which is a tiny, tiny piece of land, okay, and we have huge amounts of public discourse and policy on this. 20 years of unlimited congressional hearings, as much as you want. Well, maybe it's almost over. Information that's being generated. Why? Because the powerful group is shut out. Okay? They've got the ability to spend millions of dollars on science, on trying to prove that the environmental impacts are not so bad. They don't have to do that in Wyoming, where they can just walk in and sign a piece of paper and start drilling. All right. Portfolio effects. I think if you have one big agency, you end up with this sort of all or nothing kind of strategy, right? Here's how we're going to try to balance things out over the whole space of our jurisdiction, as opposed to let's let these agencies try different management strategies for these systems. Let's see what happens if we get a diversity of strategies. Maybe we can reduce our risk just as we would in a mutual fund. And finally, and this is an idea that you get out of federalism, for those of you who've had con law here, when we have these smaller jurisdictions, it creates the opportunity for experimentation. We wouldn't have the Marine Life Protection Act if that were all one big political jurisdiction, I can tell you right now. But California tries it, other states look to see how it works or whether it works, and it creates a more dynamic system where, rather than this one big kind of behemoth system that just sort of balances everyone's interests and doesn't do anything. Okay, so here's my lame attempt at what the better solution would look like. I actually think this is fairly pragmatic and easy. We don't have to create any new agencies. All we need to do is expand the jurisdiction. We just give some ocean to the Fish and Wildlife Service and tell them it's for wildlife refuges. We give some ocean to the Park Service and tell them it's for recreational fishing or for some other recreational use. Now, it's a tough question who gets what at the beginning, but I think if you do it right, you end up with a better system overall. That's it for me.
That's it.
Yep. Oops, I forgot my piece of paper.
Thank you very much,
Sorry
Professor Eagle.
Oh, you're welcome, sir.
Well, I think we have a little time for questions. Okay, half an hour. Well, anybody have any questions for, Professor Crowder?
Somebody pointed out the counterexample about Homeland Security, which combined a lot of small agencies into one behemoth agency,
Right.
in which FEMA clearly works better than it did before. So the idea of making a massive ocean agency is a frightening prospect, but it wasn't clear in your plan who stands for protection of ecosystem services in general. If you have a series of commodity-oriented, sectoral-oriented management units, yes, they compete with each other. They can go to court and they can keep lawyers employed and all that kind of good stuff. But I don't know where the base protection for the ecosystem services comes from, and I guess that's my question.
My argument is that those services would be protected by a combination of protecting key parts and putting those parts into essentially non-consumptive use priority agencies, okay? And the dialogue that would take place between those agencies and others in trying to coordinate across the system.
So, I'm sorry, so you would, for example, put the Fish and Wildlife Service in charge of all the MPAs, basically, and get the...
Fish and Wildlife Service would be a good choice for wildlife refuges, is what they've done in the past. We don't really have the equivalent of marine reserves on land where nothing is allowed,
Right.
except for, Rocky Mountain Arsenal. Well, even that's a wildlife refuge nowadays. But
Yeah, okay. I can see other hands. Dr. Orbach.
So I think there are two keys to all of this. One is that each entity does their job. It would be difficult to argue that the fishery management system has completely done its job and avoided overfishing.
Right.
Now, I think there are more success stories than people normally point to.
Right.
But we always look at the black holes, like New England groundfish. Sorry, Andy. So that's the first thing. The individual agencies have to do their job. If you're supposed to protect water quality, you need to protect water quality. If you're supposed to protect fisheries, you need to protect fisheries. That's the first thing. Let's assume that happens. Your model assumes that the agencies, in fact, have negotiating leverage with each other. So your Yellowstone example is one where the agencies had similar enough mandates so that they were related and relied on each other for something if only at the boundary.
Okay.
My question to you is, what happens in a system like, let's just take fisheries and water quality and habitat,
Right.
where the agencies, my read is the agencies have effectively no leverage on each other.
Right.
Okay? A fishery agency has no leverage on the EPA to make them do good water quality management
Right.
or habitat management. Doesn't your system depend on that leverage? And if so, how would you create it?
Yeah, it's a little bit different because the way I see it is the leverage comes from the model that we have now I don't see as a dominant use system, right? We have a single sector system, but the marine fisheries, but the Magnuson Act is a multiple use law, okay? It requires us to balance the needs of fishermen and conservation within this realm of uncertainty. That's what goes on, and so we end up favoring, at least what I've seen, we end up favoring the more powerful, well-organized groups. So I see that dialogue happening when essentially, let me take a step back for a second. In a perfect academic egg-headed world, we could have an experiment where we randomly divided up the ocean into 4 chunks, okay, and gave one to each use, not resource, okay, not water quality, but let's say commercial fishing, recreational fishing, oil and gas, and conservation. And let's just say we'll give them to the groups, okay? Then you allow trading to take place where essentially you end up with, well, the fishermen want to go into the conservation area because there's good fishing there. But to get that, they have to give up something. They have to say, we'll do that in an environmentally friendly way, or we'll protect some of the area in our area for you environmentalists if you let us go in there. And at the end of the day, I think you'd have a system that would be at least balanced between the uses. That's our problem now, is we don't have a good balance between non-consumptive and consumptive uses because the non-consumptive use has no power in our system in the negotiation. Okay, so the creation of power through a presumption that that's the priority use creates the power for the basis of legitimate. If two parties go into a negotiation with unequal power, they're not going to have a balanced result come out. So I know it doesn't answer your question specifically, but those are the ideas that I've been kind of trying to work through.
You know, there is one way already set up in our federal government now when agencies are at loggerheads, they go to CEQ and they get refereed by CEQ in the White House. And so in theory, Mike, if you had a president who really cared a lot about X or Y, that would be the way those disputes would eventually get resolved. They go to CEQ to the White House and they get sorted out. I don't think that's our current system, but I need to go to Andy for a minute because I think he's been anxious to say a few things
I don't know
about
about
that.
anxious. I mean, first of all, I have to say something about New England groundfish. Recovery of 14 out of 19 stocks is not a black hole. And so you need to be careful. Yeah, anymore. That's right. And so you need to be careful about assuming that a negative result holds forever. It doesn't mean that the system is unworkable if it hasn't been worked appropriately. Since you know that I'm a regulator at heart, you won't be surprised for me that I say that, you know, it's an inappropriate solution to a misdiagnosed problem, but otherwise I really liked your presentation. You know, the problem is not that you create or the recommendation, I guess I would add to that in a misreading of the report, but just to be, you know, clear about it, the recommendation is to reduce the fragmentation in programs because the fragmentation in programs doesn't actually add anything to the process except for cost and confusion. That doesn't mean that you put all of the authority for all activities in ecosystem-based management in one agency. The report doesn't say that, and I don't think anybody would advocate that. The Fish and Wildlife Service isn't going to go away. The coastal zone management activities aren't going to go away. The fisheries activities aren't going to go away, and the agencies have to actually manage those, which is why I was saying you still have sectoral activities. The problem is this tiering of the weights that you give to particular activities. And so it's not a matter of the competition between agencies end up in some kind of a balance. It's whether you can get the user groups to work on an equal footing, whether it's within one agency or 10 agencies, it doesn't make any difference. And the only way that you can do that is to give them equal essentially equal weight in the statutory authority, equal weight in the standards. And that's why you slowly make some progress in fisheries, because you've changed the balance from we want to get rid of the foreigners to, well, we have some other things that we're concerned about. Is that, balance right yet? No, absolutely not. But it has nothing to do with balancing act between agencies. To the CEQ point, I think that there is a mechanism where you sort out disputes between agencies, but it's been used very ineffectively for a very long time, including both of the, well, at least the last 3 administrations. And that's because they don't have a clear set of legislative mandates that they're doing that balancing act towards. And so I don't think it has anything to do with creating a big agency or creating, a fragmented agency. It depends on how you actually structure those mandates. Because agencies are there to implement mandates and they're not allowed to do anything else. And so they do that as well as they can within the political muscle that they have. And to expect them to do more than that is a little bit silly. And expect them to do less than that, well, you have, nasty people like Steve who will sue them when they do less than that. So they're always going to be pushed towards the mandate and never quite achieve it.
So in your view, it's all about the statutory mandate, really, in your view.
Yeah.
That's really clear. Yeah, Josh, and then Donna, yeah.
I just want to, since I got 3 insults in the first sentence, I have to have at least 1 second to respond.
I was nice to you.
No, that was nicer than he usually. No, I'll just say that my argument is not that agencies can't achieve their mandate. I just think that agencies, multiple use agencies, have a very tough mandate and a much lower chance of succeeding in conservation than agencies with very narrow specific mandates that would be conservation number 1. Okay, conservation is national standard number 1, but as we all know in practice, there's a lot of balancing that's going on.
Well, even within National Standard 1, I have to say, I served as a staffer for the U.S. Senate for a while, John Chafee, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And,
I'm going to get that.
the truth is, and Professor, the professor from Washington who wrote the 3-volume environmental treatise, Rogers, has it just right. You get to federal legislation, and what happens is you really get down in the weeds, and Tim can testify to this, and so can Lydia from their recent experience. You're writing legislation, so you're writing the mandates. And you get really way down in the weeds and everybody's arguing for their positions, and you really get it down to a fine focus, and basically nobody can really agree at the end of the day if you get it too fine a focus what the mandates are, because people aren't going to sign on to that. So what you do is you get right down and stare it in the face and you go, oh, let's just ratchet it back up about 3 tweaks on the microscope so it all looks a pretty color. Blue-green, we can all vote for blue-green. What we can't vote for are the details of blue-green. And so you pass legislation that National Standard 1 is a perfect example. Allow me. Yes, if I can read this out my glasses.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I do too, but I'm training a puppy.
Nice.
So this is such classic, Washington Congress speak. This is National Standard Uno, as in 1. Quote, conservation and management measures shall prevent overfishing while achieving, on a continuing basis, the optimum yield from each fishery for the United States fishing industry. I rest my case. 2 or 3 competing things right there in National Standard 1, and believe me, there's been litigation about every word in National Standard 1.
Yeah, I have spent the entire day without a war story, which is very difficult for me. But I have to say I was gavelled quiet in a hearing by Senator Snowe 3 times over right whale protection. The reason was she was saying, why did you implement these rules to protect right whales? And because my response each time was because the Marine Mammal Protection Act that you voted for, Senator, required it. I don't want to hear that. Tell me why you did this.
Yeah. So it's a little more, it's kind of interesting. Yes, Professor Christie.
I was just going to agree with Andy too that I don't think any of the proposals that are out there talk about really taking everything and putting it in one ocean governance management agency, but it's trying to create kind of a NEPA overlay really when you think about it, with the ocean governance plans and standards that it creates an overlay that maybe gives that extra voice to conservation over consumptive uses that you're talking about. So.
Yeah, I'd just say that's the direction it seems to be headed to me. If you read, for example, in the Pew Report, I mean, it's very strong about bringing in all these other kinds of resources into this, the national, whatever it's called, Ocean Committee
Council.
or Council, sorry.
By the way, speaking of packaging, NOPA. How about ORCA, the Ocean Resource Conservation Act? I mean,
Oh, I
let's
like
talk about packaging. And it's fun to treat Josh as a pinata, but let's have some questions for Dr. Rosenberg or yes, Dr.
I'm going to say to Andy, with respect to my blasting the New England groundfish, that the major problem there is an interesting one that actually Professor Hanna's work pointed out, and that has just been referred to as well by Andy, and that is congressional in-run interference in programs that are set up. I could easily make the case that for the majority of things that have happened in fisheries now, nationally, that have gone the way the conservation community at large did not like, and in fact, in many cases, the fisheries community didn't like in the long run, were due to congressional interference. If the agencies had been able to do the job they wanted to do, people like Andy when he was regional director, instead of the Congress coming down and said, no, Commerce, you can't do that, it'll hurt our boys and girls, that actually we'd be farther along. So my question is, how do we deal with that? The whole question of congressional interference. And Congress has oversight, they can do what they want basically. How do we stop it though in the perverse way that we've seen it unfold?
Well, I entirely agree with the prescription, but then I would, because I would say, whatever I was trying to do was the correct thing, and it's just people stop me from doing it. And obviously that's a very biased viewpoint. But there's an enormous amount of congressional interference, and I do think it's had a huge impact. It basically explains why New England was allowed to go the way that it did for so long. It also explains why, when I was regional administrator and the recovery plan was implemented, I was able to make some progress, and that's not a tribute to my skills. It has, that's barely relevant. It was because there were people who were essentially protecting me from that interference. And initially, Secretary Brown, Gary Studd's famous line about Ron Brown as Secretary of Commerce is he was the first Secretary of Commerce who knew that Noah and nymphs were not the builder of the ark and woodland elves. that they were actually agencies that did things. And they said, do the right thing and we'll cover you as far as we possibly can. Now, obviously, sometimes they couldn't. And so it is a congressional interference thing. But then in one of the joint Pew Commission, Ocean Commission meetings that actually Jane Linchenko and I set up fairly early on, Leon Panetta was there and we discussed that issue and he said, yeah, but what are you going to do? Tell congressmen not to behave as congressmen? It's not going to happen. The only thing you can do is to make it as public as possible. Because nobody wants, Bob Livingston, who used to be the congressman from Louisiana, didn't want anybody to know that he threatened the agency if we implemented an ITQ program for red snapper in the Gulf. So he also threatened us if we told anybody, then he would do even worse than, if we implemented the program, he would prevent us from spending any money on it and punitively take $10 to $20 million out of our budget. But go ahead, knock yourself out if you want to go ahead and implement the program. Well, he didn't want anybody to know he had done that except for the constituents who wanted him to do it. So the only way you do this is you get a broader group of people interested. Because you're not going to, get congressmen not to be congressmen.
Isn't this really just another variation on the theme we were asking Professor Hanna about, the short-term, long-term problem? You always got this. The short term is the fishermen are going to suffer, so the congressmen scream, so they yell at nymphs and so on.
But it's a light of day problem.
It is a light of
I agree
day.
with Andy. Had the public known this was all going on at the time, it wouldn't have gone on.
Yeah, it is a light of day problem, and there's lots of focus on individual recommendations in the report, and in the fisheries, in the commission's report, in the fisheries section, it's all about separating science from allocative decisions and so on. The most important recommendation in there, as far as I'm concerned, that would change fisheries management, and it applies to the other sectors as well, is that you should have a default action, something that has to go in place if you're not achieving your goals. Because right now, the Fisheries Service and any other regulatory agency is usually in a position of accepting a plan as better than nothing. So you end up accepting fairly horrendous plans, because the alternative is, if you reject a plan from a management council, then the old plan or no plan stays in place. So your decision is this better than nothing? You don't get to change any recommendation from a council. You don't get to say, well, I'm going to reject this and I'm going to implement my own plan. You get to accept it or reject it. And so that puts all of the cards on the side of somebody who wants to delay any significant action. And that's why you get, things like the summer flounder plan accepted. That's why you get, stellar sea lion plans accepted in the North Pacific Council, because the Fisheries Service can't make another decision. Because if they reject it, the default is no action. The default needs to be strong action, not no action. And that recommendation is in the report, and it'll be the second shortest lived recommendation right after get rid of the National Flood Insurance Program.
Oh, there's a topic. Other questions? Let's have some questions. Chad.
I'm not sure which of these plans I'm necessarily sold on, whether we aggregate or disaggregate these government agencies, but I've seen a trend today of people talking about litigation in these cases, and not to put people like Steve out of a job or anything, but if we're litigating these, haven't the regulatory agencies and the regulations in some way failed? Shouldn't there be more resources put towards these enforcement
I don't know.
efforts?
Are you a lawyer?
Nope.
Okay, but you read the Constitution. So does that mean that, yeah, partly, but I mean, does that mean that if every one of the three branches doesn't do things perfectly, then they have failed? No, I mean, that's why you actually have the balance. So, I mean, even though I was incredibly rude to Josh just for entertainment value, the fact that people are arguing over the structure of whether you aggregate or disaggregate and where is that tension point is hugely important, because actually it doesn't, I don't think that there's a model that works better. But you're trying to find that balancing act where, yeah, there is a litigation hammer, if there has to be, but you get more accountability into the executive branch, and you get the legislative branch to put in some decent mandates and then get the hell out of the way. In other words, you're trying to make that triumvirate work, not just expecting one of the three is all of a sudden going to do everything perfectly.
Josh.
Just, one quick note. I mean, one of the interesting things is when you look at the rationales for municipal zoning, going back when it started around 1900, essentially everything was multiple use. That's the way to look at land use, okay, in a city. And one of the reasons, or one of the rationales for creating what I'm sort of arguing here for the ocean, residential, commercial, separating out uses, was to eliminate or lessen the amount of litigation that was going on between these conflicting uses. Because when people have a guaranteed place where they know, they have certainty about they can pursue their activity, okay, and their value is protected in that area, and we have fewer nuisances don't really apply, we have, because it's not private land in the ocean. But we have the idea, at least one of my ideas, that we'll have less litigation, and you see that there are fewer lawsuits per acre against the National Park Service than there are against the Bureau of Land Management, because there are fewer conflicts between users going on, because Congress was clear that recreation was the #1 use in the parks.
Speaking of zoning, I've got to ask Andy, how do you get buy-in? I loved your charts about the Gulf of Maine and going to the bullseye zoning approach, but how do you get buy-in to that approach? And I think Dr. Orbach said had a few thoughts about ocean zoning as well.
Yeah.
How do you get buy-in?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think what Josh is talking about in zoning is incredibly important. One of the ways that you get buy-in is that you try to reduce the number of groups that you're actually impacting. You don't want every area to be a multiple use area, because every area isn't a multiple use area. So you try to reduce down the number of groups. The only way you got big closed areas in the Gulf of Maine was by setting aside the recreational fishing guys and saying, okay, that's not the proximate problem. It is now, but it wasn't then. So all of a sudden they're not arguing against, the closed areas, or what is effectively a large zone of 6,000 closed area miles. So you do have to limit the number of groups, and I think that's the point about what happened in local zoning laws. Secondly, you do have to negotiate some buy-in, but buy-in is relative. I don't believe that buy-in means that all the groups agree and they're just happy with this zone. You also, I'm with you, you need a big hammer. But to do that, you have to have a pretty clear mandate that allows you to use a hammer, because you can't require people to do things unless something's going to happen if they don't. And, you know, you only negotiate as far as you can, but you're not going to get buy-in of all the groups. Everybody will be delighted to have all the other groups excluded.
Sure. Well, so let's talk about buy-in. So you're gonna get buy-in. No, where I was raised, you got carrots and you got sticks to get buy-in.
Yeah, we didn't get the carrots. But, you know,
I mean,
you had
I'd
an
like
easy
to talk
life.
about what the carrots and sticks are. Yes, Mike?
I think there's an interesting implication, I think, for Josh's philosophy, which is appealing to me in many ways, because we are still treating the ocean right now effectively the way we treated land 300 years ago and zoning at the turn of the century. It's a place where you ought to get to do whatever you want unless something's specified. That's what we have to stop. And so I have used this phrase, the policy enclosure of the world ocean. That's what we need to do. And I think Josh's idea is a way to do it. But doesn't it necessarily mean in a nation state that the basic structural argument has to occur at the legislative level in Congress?
Yes.
I mean, isn't that an implication? You don't create an agency or set of it. You don't create, with all due respect, the current Ocean Council and have the agencies work it out. That's probably not going to happen.
No, you have to have an Ocean Policy Act.
What's that?
You have to have an Ocean Policy Act that says these are the things we want to do.
Well, and here's where we want to do them.
Yeah.
So my question is, does that imply that really to do ocean zoning, it's got to be done in Congress?
Yes,
I mean, yes and a no. Perfect.
No.
Perfect.
I think, because if you look at what's the difference between chunk A, BLM land, chunk B, Park Service land, the difference is the decisions about what happens in BLM land take place at the agency. The decisions about what takes place in the Park Service mostly took place in Congress, right? Congress made most of the decisions. And that's what I think Congress is going to be better overall at protecting conservation, at protecting underrepresented interests than the agencies will be. Now, I'm not talking about Senator Stevens.
Well, I think that's in part true, and it's actually best illustrated by the ANWR debate. And you said there's a lot of attention on ANWR, nothing on the drilling in the lower 48. Well, that's because Congress has held to themselves the decision on whether you would drill in ANWR, and they haven't held it from the agencies. They've given authority to the agency to do that, and they've given a mandate to the agency that you have to find places to drill. So the agency, it's not that the agency is subverting that conservation mandate. They don't have a conservation mandate in the lower 48. So Congress has to do a part of the zoning. They have to set up a structure that it enables zoning, but I don't think Congress needs to make each of the individual decisions about where and what will occur. They have to put in place a mandated process that allows those decisions to be made in a way that I would argue does deal with some of the multiple use issues. And then the first task is to figure out who has to argue over which pieces. Now, whether that has to be set up by congressional mandate or not, I don't know. But I think that you can't expect I think the BLM example is a really good one, particularly with oil and gas. You can't expect the agency is going to go well beyond its mandate in terms of conservation. And I don't think they have anything like a strong mandate for conservation. They have a mandate to protect the ranchers in the oil and gas industry.
It says balanced conservation.
Sure, but it says that in the Magnuson Act too. But, you know, there's all kinds of weasel words in there because of staffers like Steve. But, I'm an equal opportunity insulter. There's all kinds of weasel words in there, but then look at the principal mandates. You got a lot closer in the fisheries law than you do in the whatever the...
FLIPMA.
Yeah.
FLIPMA. Yes, sir.
It seems that what Josh kind of hit on that I like that we've kind of been ignoring is how the decision is made. Right? That seems to be a very key point, that if we're going to delegate all these decisions down, that's going to give less impact to people that are, to get done things through organization, through voice, and through, basically making noise. It's going to empower those people that are there every day at the agency trying to get goodies out of the goodie bag. So I think that this whole key, whether it's the ANWR lower 48 comparison, I think that there's something there. And Andy's point about what we need the strong mandate from Congress, that would also solve the issue. That would give us the exact same thing. But what I like about Josh's paradigm is it seems more likely that we're going to get that than the strong mandate. I mean, I just don't see this Congress saying, all right, here is you know, if you don't regulate, we're just going to conserve the whole thing. I just don't. Instead, it would be just the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, two things about this. You need to be careful not to focus on the current Congress, I think, because, you know, in the current Congress, you're not going to get anything very positive out of the process. And so you do need some kind of fallback strategy, and that's how you structure the mandates. And that has to happen whether you do it in a disaggregated system or you do it in an aggregated system. The second point I'd make is, of course, we cooked this up beforehand. I would insult him early on, so you jump in and defend him and protect him, and so everybody would agree with his.
It worked out very well, too. And we have time for a couple more. Oh, how about Susan and then Larry?
Yeah, Josh, I think your presentation was really interesting, and I mean, a lot of very interesting ideas, but I'm sitting here wondering how appropriate an example is BLM. And because I think, really, if you look at BLM, it reflects its cultural, biogeographic context of the interior West pretty well for its past up until now. And what is common, I think, for ocean resources and for the kinds of resource issues that you're raising about BLM is that we are really at the cusp of some pretty significant changes in public attitudes and cultural values about resource use that are being reflected now in questions being raised by non-consumptive users about BLM grazing policies. For example, you didn't get those questions in the past, and the reason you're getting those questions now is because people like you and me who live on the west sides of the state are wanting to go to the east sides and have maybe recreational use of some of these lands that we never did before. We considered that the land for ranchers and for miners. Same with the ocean. I think there's a lot more cultural public demand, changing values for different kinds of uses. We don't consider fisheries to be just the purview of extractive users anymore. I think we're really, and how to manage those changing social public attitudes and values is a really difficult question, I think. But that's at the heart of both the ocean resource question and the public lands question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the difference is, I would argue that creating these protected or different, the equivalent of parks or places where the agency is focused on conservation is more important in the ocean than it even is on the public lands, because on the public lands at least you have the umbrella consumptive use of non-motorized recreation standing in the shoes of conservation, right? That's how we got a lot of our parks, was through recreation. We don't have any such equivalent in the oceans, unless some people would say maybe recreational fishing. But we don't have non-consumptive use except in our minds of, we don't go visit, or I've seen the bionic dolphin, where you can take the bionic dolphin and go look at the fish. But scuba diving is a tiny little thing. We don't have that non-consumptive use to represent conservation in the political process. So my whole idea is that these presumptions in favor of conservation stand in the place of public participation, because I don't agree, actually. I don't think that public participation in favor of conservation will ever be at a level where I can depend on it to protect the oceans. Like, I want to be able to never go to a council meeting again and know that things will turn out okay, rather than have to go to every single one and put my head in a vice.
Yeah.
That's
The dream, the impossible dream, isn't it?
Right.
Let's close with Dr. Crowder, then we'll have to wrap this down. Yes.
I mean, the thing I like about Josh's design is that there is some enabling of the conservation lobby, which is now very weak. And I think we have to go back to why we're all here, and that is the conclusion that the oceans are in trouble. And whatever it says in the current legislation about conservation clearly hasn't worked. There's sort of conservation Gifford Pinchot, like let's conserve the trees to cut them down, let's conserve the fish to harvest them. And there's conservation to John Muir to protect the structure and function of those systems. And one of the key things that's in both these commission reports, and certainly in the Compass statement on ecosystem-based management, is the need to protect the basic ecosystem services on which all those extractive uses ultimately depend. And there's not an agency that stands for that function, as far as I know. I mean, it's like, it's in the legislation, it's in standard 1, but I don't see where that is. So how would that get enacted so Josh doesn't have to go to any more fisheries council meetings is my concern.
Right, and that's what Mr. Profetto is going to lead us in a discussion of next, after the break.
Is that it?
I think that's it, how we're going to make that all happen, how we're going to get to John Muir.
And it's going to be a reasonably quick break, so there's going to be people shuffling you back in a few minutes, so,
Back at 3:30.
yeah, be back in 30 minutes.
Thank you all very much. How about for a big hand for the panel?